Okay, so I will turn it over to our facilitators today, Toby and Giles.
Thank you very much. I'm Toby Rader. I am calling in today from the unceded territory of the Sisseton people here in Port Alberni. So I give lots of gratitude to the grandmothers and grandfathers and the ancestors of this land. Obviously, those who are following the news know that we just recently discovered 17 unmarked graves here in Port Alberni, and an acknowledgement of 67 deaths due to residential schools. So it's important that I say that and I acknowledge those pieces. So just a quick little blurb about me. I am a crisis intervention specialist with the mobile response team, which I will explain as we get into the workshop. I am a registered social worker and I practice narrative therapy. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Giles to introduce himself, and then we'll jump into the workshop.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much, Toby. My name is Giles Ringer. I am coming to you gratefully as I look around at a cloudy day from the traditional unceded territory of the Silk Okanagan Nation. I'm in Kelowna currently, what is known as Kelowna now. But yeah, obviously abundantly grateful to be here. I'm a settler from Treaty 1 territory back in Manitoba. Only moved out here about 2 years ago, but I as well am a registered social worker here in BC and a crisis intervention specialist with the provincial mobile response team. Thank you, Toby.
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen now. Oh, this is all funny now. Okay, here we go. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, we can see it.
Perfect. All right. So first of all would be our provincial acknowledgement. So we are gratefully acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the First Nations in the place we currently call BC. So as a provincial team, we are span the scope of Western Turtle Island and all First Nations that exist and are the stewards of the land here. And so that's a really important piece that MRT is keen to acknowledge and wish to make clear. So the mobile response team, who are we? We are a provincial outreach team that provides short-term psychosocial support to frontline workers, first responders, and people with lived and living experience who are impacted by the dual health public health emergencies. So COVID-19 and the opiate catastrophe that's happening right now. So we do everything from agency consultation, workshops. We provide individual and group support. We do really formal debrief and really informal debrief due to crisis response. The best way to think about MRT is that we are doing what is called post and pre-crisis response. So we're not responding to immediate crisis. We're usually trying to create capacity before we have crisis. And then we move into post-crisis where we're doing some work to support you after an event. So we are a free of no cost to you, free service, and completely confidential. So when you call or you email or you text, you don't have to tell us who you are necessarily. You just have to tell us you're a worker and you're struggling with what you're struggling with, whether that's at work or at home. The goal here is for you to show up with good health and wellness. Is there anything I'm missing, Giles, that you think I need to add?
At this point, I don't think so. I think you basically cleared it. We're free and we're here to support you.
Cool. Let's move on. So we're going to talk about, it's jumping, creating and maintaining healthy boundaries. So the learning objectives of today are really simple. It's going crazy on me now. Okay, we're going to look at what boundaries are and why they're important. We're going to identify characteristics of unhealthy and healthy boundaries. We're going to identify and set professional boundaries. So we're going to identify what are professional boundaries and in what way do we build and maintain those boundaries in a workplace. And as always, with MRT, we're going to ask you to do some self-reflection, and we're going to ask you to look and identify some personal strategies and areas in which you can improve your boundaries. And this is about building, again, those self-reliance, that internal capacity how do we stay healthy in the work? One of those big things is maintaining our boundaries and understanding where those boundaries come from and how they play a role in the work we're doing. This is my favorite quote about boundaries. So daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others. And I think that's a big important thing here, is that we acknowledge that boundaries are more about us than they are about somebody else. They're about a way of acknowledging the love we have for ourselves and the love we want to have for others, but first meeting what's important to us. Is there anything else you want to say, Giles, or step in anytime?
Sorry, I was going to say just briefly before we move on that if anybody does have any questions, please just put them in the chat, and we'll address all of them at the end. All right.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks, Giles. Yeah, so I think it's, again, really important that we recognize that boundaries are things that are about us. They're about how we move through the work and how we move through our lives, and keep us focused on what, for lack of a better word, maybe is the mission that we're setting forth. So why are boundaries important? So boundaries give us a sense of self. Boundaries are how we define how one wants to be treated. So not just ourselves, but how others maybe want to be treated. Boundaries support positive work-life decisions. Boundaries support health and happiness. Boundaries can be empowering. So again, looking inside of you and understanding who you are and where you're coming from and how you're showing up is going to help you understand what your boundaries are and what those boundaries mean. And how you stay safe in the work is how you present those boundaries to others. There are different types of boundaries. There's personal boundaries. So relationship with self, your self-discipline, thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, protection from feeling guilty from somebody else's negative feelings. So again, if boundaries are about showing ourselves love, then when somebody else is upset with our boundaries, that's not our feeling of guilt. We don't get to take that on. We need to say, that's how this is for me, and this is where it sits for me, and this is how I need to be. Giles, do you have anything to add to that?
I would agree that I think that's one of the things that's really hard for a lot of us is trying to make sure that those personal boundaries, we actually respect ourselves enough. And this isn't to make anybody feel bad about the fact you're not respecting yourself, but the more that we stand up on our own boundaries, the more people get to know, okay, like so-and-so, let's say Toby, has clear boundaries about whether or not he's going to be, flying away on our job over the weekend, or whether or not he's made it clear, my work hours are XYZ, they don't include the weekend, and so my manager knows that he just won't even ask, or they won't ask because you have other obligations. So it's really important for those things. Absolutely.
And that goes to that place of self-discipline where we're really clear about what our boundaries are and we hold to them. That's a really important thing. So it's key, not just in our personal life, but in our professional life as well. So we have material boundaries. So lending or giving belongings, money, clothes, car, toothbrush. I think that's a pretty common thing. I certainly wouldn't share my toothbrush with Giles. I'd share my car with Giles, but I probably would not share my toothbrush. So those are some of these are like pretty standard ideas around boundaries. We have physical boundaries. Again, personal space, a hug or a handshake. And we need to consider what are cultural boundaries within those physical boundaries, within those material boundaries, and within those personal boundaries. That's really important here. I grew up in an Italian home, so boundaries, personal physical boundaries are very small, right? We don't have a lot of space between those, but I know other people who aren't comfortable with that. So I think it's important that we remember those pieces. So we have mental boundaries. So thoughts, values, and opinions. And we must listen with an open mind and without judgment. So that that is also what we require others to do with us. So if we're going to listen with an open mind and without judgment, we want others to do the same. And I think in our work, particularly providing care to people, whatever that looks like, we need to be able to listen without judgment, and hear those things, and not be again have feelings of guilt or feelings of or bad feelings when those are different than our own, if that makes sense. Giles, do you have anything to add to that one?
I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think coming back to any of the boundaries, coming back to how we perceive it. If somebody has an issue with it, it ends up being the individual's struggle that they need to work on, not on your own, right? You've made your own boundaries based on what you know is good for yourself, your mental and your thoughts and your opinions and your values, and those things, standing on those. And I think all of the boundaries come back to taking an opportunity to be mindful and reflecting on what your boundaries are, taking that time to be able to explore what your boundaries are. So yeah, absolutely.
So we have these things called professional boundaries, and they're limits and responsibilities of our role. The separation of work and personal life. Consistency supports the client and your team. I think that we also have these boundaries around what are our ethics, what are our licensing. You know, if we're nurses, as a social worker, I have a code of ethics and a standard of practice that I have to abide by, same as Giles, much like nurses, doctors, anybody who's licensed. And I think then we have these professional boundaries that sort of cross over into what are the boundaries of our employer or our place of work. And it gets muddy and it gets mixed up sometimes. And I think that we can understand those professional boundaries when we understand our personal boundaries and our mental boundaries and our physical boundaries a lot better. And I think, again, we have to take into cultural pieces of this as well. So we're going to look deeper into professional boundaries as well as we get through this webinar. So these ideas of spiritual boundaries are very similar to the ideas of cultural boundaries. So beliefs and experiences. We need to be aware of those and understand those and take those into account when we're doing the work we're doing and when we're setting boundaries, whether professional or personal. And I think that that's a really important place to sit. They kind of encompass all pieces of it. Before I move off, is there anything, Giles, you want to add? So here we're going to look at professional boundaries. So these are guidelines for maintaining professional and positive and helpful relationships. They're not set in stone. They're movable. They can be adjust based on the workplace and the work you're doing and the people you're working with. But they're really a set of guidelines, a way that we understand how we're going to be with people in the helping profession. A clear understanding of the limits and responsibilities of our role. And those really often come out of what the agency wants, what our job description is, what our licensing tells us. But they're also the way we show up. So that clear understanding of the limits and responsibilities of our role, or how do we show up and how do we want to show up to the work? The ability to know where you end and the client begins. I think that is a particularly unclear place within mental health and within the work we do. And some might say that is troublesome, but I think that that's a positive place to be. I think when we are a little unclear as to where we end and the client begins, it's okay. It's okay to, take it home with you for a minute and have a thought about it. It's okay to be unsure as to what happens, particularly when you work in small rural communities or when you're working in really intimate spaces like care homes or hospitals or group homes or supportive housing. Those are really difficult to understand what that looks like. And we're going to talk further about how we have that conversation with others around when it feels like it's kind of meshing together. Professional boundaries are the container within which we work, right? It's the way we have relationship. It it's ultimately, again, how we show up. So when we look back and we have that self-reflection of self, how we show up will determine what our professional boundaries look like. And it's the space between a helper's work and a personal life. And again, that's kind of gray. And it doesn't always mean that there's a fine line between those things. And again, I think as long as there's discussion and conversation and a willingness to acknowledge that, then we're in a safe place. It's when that is not being talked about, then we get into trouble. I'm gonna throw it over to Giles for a quick sec.
So this is where I get on my soapbox a little bit. I would say that Toby and I would be strong believers in talk. As social workers, Toby as a therapist as well. The benefit of being able to just express what's going on to a neutral party can be very, very, very beneficial, and it can actually alleviate some of the stress to the point of you not needing to go to a next step of something like a more clinical support, right? We'd always say, I was talking to one of the individuals on here previously that actually no, it's to my manager just before that I'm fine to come and support this space because at 2 o'clock I have a counseling session. She goes, oh wow, okay, yeah, I should probably get on that. So counseling is always great, but the opportunity to be able to talk to individuals about what's going on is hugely important. So when Toby is talking about how you go home at the end of the day and you may end up carrying some of the work home with you, that's normal. It's not something that we go outside and go, okay, I'm going to do some sort of ritual, right? I'm going to hop, skip, and jump, and all of a sudden all my troubles of the day are gone. One needs to do something to create the space between yourself and work, and it takes time, it takes effort, it takes habits, and it takes getting it wrong to figure out how you can figure out it best for yourself. So but professional boundaries, this is where that really comes in, and finding either a safe space within work to be able to alleviate some of that stress or have that conversation, or to find somebody outside of it, like for instance MRT, to be able to talk to individuals about it. Thanks, Toby.
Absolutely. Giles, can you just remind the group what one of the tools you use when you need to talk to somebody who is not part of your team and not part of your counseling team and not your family? Where do you go?
So yeah, thanks, Toby. I think that's a great point. Every time I go to a shelter, because I work a lot with shelters in the Okanagan area, I bring up the point that I use crisis lines. I have crisis lines on my phone. I've worked on crisis lines, and I'm very familiar with how they work. And no crisis line is going to turn you away if you're calling because you need support. And so I will go to 3 agencies in one city, and at the end of the day, I'm recognizing that I'm just carrying weight. I'm not a harm to myself or anybody else. I am still positive, but I recognize that there's heaviness that's on me, and so I reach out and I call one of the crisis lines, like Wellness Together Canada, or KUA's crisis line, the Indigenous crisis line coming out of Port Alberni. These are opportunities to have somebody just go, wow, that's really heavy. How are you managing? How are you coping? What are you doing for yourself? Thank you for doing the job that you do. And it's really easy to forget how much that is important for us, because we all get tired in our jobs. And so to have somebody to reach out to, like for me, crisis lines, I find it to be very beneficial. And we can talk more a little bit about that later if you like.
Thanks, Giles. That's a great point, because it reminds us that it's easy for us to be overwhelmed or overworked or full of thoughts and step outside of that container, and these professional boundaries that hold us to be able to do this work in a good way. And so, yeah, having conversation and talking about it is going to be one of the best ways to move out of a struggle where you feel like your boundaries are not working. Yeah. So why are professional boundaries important? I mean, we just talked about this, but one of the biggest things is it reduces that anxiety. I know for myself, having spent many years working in and out of private and nonprofit organizations, and definitely having the clients I worked with, the anxiety is real. You sometimes showing up to work is just hard. But knowing what my intention is, which is what my boundaries are, and how I want to show up for the work about looking after me, helps reduce those boundaries or that anxiety. It creates that clear expectations. It helps me to maintain that physical, mental, and emotional safety. And that doesn't mean that I am not unwell. You must have illness to have wellness. But it means that I'm aware of what my body's doing. I'm more aware of what my mind is thinking and my emotions are happening in my body. It helps me maintain an ethical relationship. And that ethical relationship is not just the ethics in which I am licensed to practice or have to follow, but also the ethical relationship I have with ethics and the idea of ethical work, and the ethical relationship I have with myself. How am I looking after me? And if I'm looking after me, I'm able to look after my two beautiful children and my partner, and then able to do the work better. So they become a role model for healthy communication, professional relationships. So it's a way, again, how we show up. It's a way that we are with people, and we are with our colleagues, the way we are with the people we work with. And I think really important that the healthy communication and professional relationships, that modeling of that isn't different with the people we work alongside and our teammates. They're one and the same. And the way that I work with people in my work alongside is the same way I treat Giles, the same way I work with Giles. And that's important. It's important that I role model to him as much as he role models to me, and I model to others how we're going to be together. How I am in community is the same as I am at work. It's important that those things present the same way, because it helps reduce that anxiety. It becomes clear on how I'm going to be. I don't get to just be one way at home and one way at work. I don't get to be one way in community and one way at work. Otherwise, it doesn't become clear. It becomes messy and hard to understand that. It can protect the worker from misunderstandings and role confusion. And sometimes that's really important when you're working in a setting like a care home where you have multiple professions working in one space, and knowing what the role of the care aide is versus the role of the nurse. And that the nurse understands what the care aide is capable of and what the care aide can do and won't be asked to do. Those are important things, and vice versa. Same with a doctor and a nurse. I know in our team, we have a very diverse team with many, many backgrounds. And Giles and I are the only social workers on the team. So yay. But it certainly does play a different role within our team in understanding that piece. And it helps to protect the reputation of the worker and the agency. So again, it's again how we show up and why we're showing up within the context and the container in which the work has asked us to do it. In professional boundaries, any kind of boundary helps us to avoid this idea of favoritism. It helps us to avoid any miscommunication or misunderstanding of how we're going to be, how we're going to show up as humans, how we're going to show up as workers, how we're going to show up in our community. Giles, anything you want to add? Perfect. So, professional boundaries for supportive relationships. They need to be planned and goal-directed. What does this mean? It means that we want to know what our boundaries are before we go into a supportive relationship, and we know what they're going to be when we leave. So in our world, we talk about working towards termination all of the time. We enter a relationship, we want people to know what the intention of the relationship. We also want to be working towards a place of ending that relationship. In MRT, one of the things that I've discovered is that we often enter into that place, we plan it, we direct it, we have all that goal, we move out of it, and we've ended it. And then 3 months later, we start the relationship again with the same person. And I think that's very common in the helping profession. So that's really important. Supportive relationships and boundaries within supportive relationships have to have purpose. They provide the person we're providing care to, their needs. We need to know that what we're doing is for them and not for us. So they benefit the person we're working alongside. Always. Professional boundaries are more about the people we're providing care to than just about us. We recognize the vulnerability in the person. So we need to remember that the people we're providing care to are in a place of a very vulnerable state, whether they're in a hospital, a care home, on the street, in an office building, in a supportive housing. The fact that they're having care or asking for care puts them in a vulnerable place. Our boundaries need to recognize that. It offers autonomy from systems while maintaining access to help. So our boundaries allow for us to work with somebody in a good way, in a helpful way, while they get the right to make choices in their life. We often talk about people who live on the street, especially adults. They have the right to live at risk, and we need to allow for that autonomy to happen. People who are in hospitals or care homes, they have the right to be there. They have the right to understand their care, and we have the responsibility to set those boundaries of how that's going to be, just as they have the right to set those boundaries as well. Anything else, Giles?
No, I think that's great, Toby. You hit the head on the nail there.
Perfect. So, characteristics of healthy boundaries. Me and my space, you and your space. So when you have healthy boundaries, you are willing and able to delegate responsibilities or ask for help when needed. So it goes back to that piece that Giles was talking about. When you ask for help, you're demonstrating and you're modeling healthy boundaries. You also have the ability to say, hey, I need you to do this because this is what I'm going to do, right? In planning this today, getting ready for this today, we had a switch in partnership here. So I had to bring Giles in and I just basically phoned him and said, this is what I need you to do. And he graciously joined up, right? But I needed him to know what those boundaries were for me and what my expectations were. And he was able to tell me the same. So that's important that we are able to do those things. They are, to be honest, are able to be honestly expressed what you need and what you want. That's really important. To maintain personal values despite what others want. To acknowledge when boundaries are breached. This is the hard part. Most people don't do this very well. When somebody crosses your line or steps outside of what you've asked or what you've set forth, you need to be able to say, this isn't okay. And that is a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to do in our personal life. It's a hard thing to do in our professional life. In our professional boundaries, I'll tell you, I am much better in my professional boundaries than I am in my personal boundaries. And my learning in my professional boundaries is transferring to my professional boundaries. So I think that's important. It's important to recognize maybe your skill is really good. Maybe you're really good at telling people, hey, this is where it is in my personal life, but in my professional life, I'm not very good at that when it gets breached. Find that skill that you're using in your personal life or in your professional life and find a way to marry those two, because it does make a big difference. So some characteristics are you talk to yourself with kindness, humor, love, and respect. That is a big one. How we speak to ourselves, the words we use, the way we engage with self-talk and self-criticism or anything like that needs to be done in kindness. And when we do that for ourselves, we then do it with others. So when people breach our boundaries, we need to be able to say to them in a nice way, not in a mean way. And I think the same thing has to happen for ourselves. We need to talk to ourselves with love and respect and kindness. Healthy characteristics of healthy boundaries don't allow someone to take advantage of your generosity. You can say no without guilt, which is always hard. Anybody who's a parent knows how hard this is to say no. And trust your own decisions. Recognize that what you what the choice you're making, the feeling you're going with your gut, that's important. That's what you know to be true. Trust it. It's probably not failed you before. I think the other, sort of saying always is say what you mean what you say, and don't be mean. So I think those are important things. I'm going to ask Giles to step in if he has any questions or thoughts.
I would totally agree. And I think the if you've ever, even if you don't have children, but like whether it be a niece or a nephew or you're a grandparent or anything like that, it's very easy for those sort of boundaries. And sometimes they're loose because we do things and we want to help people. And so that can happen in our personal as well as our professional life. And so when we try to do something for an individual that's outside of what we would typically do, what doesn't match our boundaries, that creates that gap that it's harder and harder to come back from once you start to step that way. And personally, as a parent, I mean, that's consistency with parenting. I do not get the gold star for that. But that being said, my partner and I certainly try our best to be as consistent as possible. But yeah, I think saying no is a hard one, especially for me, especially in the workplace. I've become much better in my personal life. But yeah, the workplace is still something working towards. So I think one thing I want to point out is that, as Toby and I have both identified, is that it is always a work in progress, because there's always going to be something brought to you that you can learn from. And it may also pique your interest about, oh, that's a boundary that I actually don't identify as my own, but that actually really resonates quite closely with my own beliefs. So thanks.
Thank you. So we have these different types of boundaries necessarily. We have consistent boundaries. Those are those boundaries that we just are, right? Like, this is the way this is, and we don't kind of waver from those. Then we have these limited boundaries that kind of roll into those ideas of, they're time sensitive usually. They only have a few days to them, or they're only for a minute. Like today, my child wanted me to play with her, and I said, no, right now, daddy needs to work for 15 minutes. That's a limited boundary. And doesn't mean that I'm no is for the rest of the day, or forever. It's just 15 minutes. I need 15 minutes. Then we get into these vague or inconsistent boundaries, and that's where we get into trouble. We start to get into trouble with these boundaries because they're not clear to anybody else, let alone yourself. And sometimes it's okay for somebody to give you a hug, and then other times it's not okay for somebody to give you a hug. And I think that this is where workers tend to get into trouble with colleagues and with the people they're working alongside, because it's not clear. It's not clear to you. It's not clear to them, and so people don't really know where to tread and where you stand. And then you get people into these really rigid boundaries who can't move, and we all know them. We all have a mess of those people in our lives. And rigid boundaries aren't bad. They're important. There's some really strict and rigid boundaries I have with how people are in my life, but they can get in the way for some people in our personal life and our professional life. And usually it's when they're not being kind to us. I can't think of a good rigid boundary right at this moment. I don't know, Giles, do you have one?
So I'm going to be completely candid here. One of my children identifies within the LGBTQ plus community, and we have extended family members who have identified disagreement with that. And my partner and I have just simply said, there will be zero conversation with that child if you do not come from a place of acceptance and love, because that is the expectation, that is the boundary. Because as they are finding who they are, that needs to be paramount. So I would say that would be a rigid boundary.
Yeah, there'll be a positive rigid boundary for sure, right? I mean, I think for especially for your child and for your family, right? And maybe it's difficult on the other end too. But we don't know, right? It's also a consistent boundary. So we often have these rigid boundaries that stay very consistent. They don't waffle. And I think that sometimes we get caught up in policy and procedure as being a rigid boundary. It's not always a boundary. That is a way that people want us to work or exist. But we recently had a question about that in our team about, can we reverse an overdose if we're present with an overdose? And probably our PHSA policy says no, based on our work. But is that a boundary, or is that a rigid boundary? Or is that a policy? And I think those are the questions that people need to ask and have conversation about.
Sorry, just quickly going back to recognizing if anybody and knowing who we're speaking with, the audience here, if you've ever worked with individuals with severe persistent mental health, dementia, and any of those, right, like individuals who, well, any individual that you might be working with, doesn't really matter. If you have vague or inconsistent boundaries, whereas one time one individual says, yes, I would like some coffee now, right? And you go, okay, well, I'll go get it, even though I don't know all the circumstances, just to be clear about that. But I'll go get coffee now. But then the next day they ask for coffee at the same time. They say, well, there's no coffee now. You're not allowed to have it, right? That can be something that can certainly put your residents off, or your patients off. And so making sure those things are in line and consistent with the individuals you're working for or working with is extremely beneficial. And as those boundaries become more consistent and those things become modeled more, the people around you begin to know that the question doesn't need to happen. They already know what the answer is because your boundaries have been consistent, that a coffee at 1 o'clock cannot happen. Just as for a little instance.
Yeah, no, that's very good. That's a great example. So when is it time to work on boundaries? So you can see in this little diagram, you have like me and my personal space, you and your personal space, and this unclear or no personal space. It's when you start to see these things kind of fall over top of each other. When you're having trouble saying no, even saying yes is undesirable or inconvenient. I find it hard sometimes to say no to my children, and sometimes I find it hard to say yes to my children. So those get confusing. We feel like you are the only person who can do certain things and help a certain person. This is really dangerous. This is what we call enmeshment. This is a dangerous place for workers to get to. And I think we've all found ourselves there at different times in our work. And that's when we need to look at what our boundaries are. And that's when we really need to check ourselves and figure out whether or not we're being kind to us, because this is an example of not taking care of yourself. So feelings of happiness depending on other people's approval. It's like, that's a really important thing. I just had a conversation with our manager about that. So not about me, but about her, which is great, right? We really have a really lovely manager who really loves to have those conversations with us. So we're really lucky that way. When we allow someone to take as much as they can from us, that's really, really important. I'll be very candid. My father is somebody who will do something for you, but then expect 10 times things in return, right? We all know those people. And it can be a lot. He can take a lot from me, and he feels that I've taken a lot from him. So I just don't engage in that with him any longer. My boundary is really clear, right? If you do this for me, you don't get something in return. You just do this as kindness because you're my dad. So trust no one or trust anyone. This idea of black and white thinking. Go against personal values or rights to please another person. Often feel burdened or take advantage of. And believe others can anticipate your needs. None of us can read minds. I don't know about you, Giles. Maybe you can. I can't. I wish I could sometimes. Sometimes I'm really glad I can't. But again, all of these are things around when we are affected personally, when we really aren't looking after ourselves. And those should be warning signs for us. Hey, we're either not being clear about our boundaries, or we're not even sure what our boundaries are at this time. And taking that step back, looking at ourselves, having discussion with people you trust to have that discussion with, having discussion with people who aren't part of your agency, who aren't part of what you're doing, crisis lines, MRT, we're happy to have those conversations. This is how we can have that, figure out what that feels like, whether even people who maybe are spiritual leaders or cultural leaders in your communities, who can help you understand what those boundaries are and where they're coming from, and where you're losing sight of them, how they're crossing over. Giles?
Yeah, I would agree 100%. And this brings me back to the idea of compassion fatigue. And when individuals are working outside their boundaries, and as soon as you started talking about this, I quickly grabbed. So I've got my teapot here, right? And I'm just drinking tea because I've already had my 6 cups of coffee this morning. I do feel as though in any sort of helping industry, we go out and we provide some support, right? And we're like, yeah, I will help you. And then all of a sudden, somebody asks you to do something, and it's outside of what you actually have the ability to do, or it's outside of the boundaries that you sort of hold up for yourself. You think about that, and you provide it anyways, and then you go, okay, now I still have to do my job. Now I still have to not only do my job, but I have to go home and I have to take care of family. Something we talk about regularly is the fact that the stress from our current societal environment is increasing the level of stress. Pandemic just came over, which is still obviously lingering around, as you all know. We've got this war in Ukraine, we've got high cost of living, we've got deaths from overdose and all sorts of things going on. But all of that is even outside of the family unit. So maybe you're an individual who lives on your own, but you may have family that is outside of your home area or out of the province, and something may be going on there. And you need to go and address something there, but you've given everything of yours, physically, emotionally, mentally, at work, because you poured out the last drips of your cup. And now you have to go and do the supports that you really care about, because you're going to say yes to things. And so if you're not creating those boundaries, you're not holding your ability, your care for yourself close enough, and you're going to end up with a lack of ability to be able to continue to support your heaviness. The stress that's going to be on you is going to increase exponentially. And so it really plays into our level of fatigue and stress, and well-being overall.
Yeah, absolutely. Be aware of how much is left in your cup before you empty it, please. So building and maintaining healthy boundaries in the workplace, establish clear agreements with the person regarding your role, whether it's your teammate, whether it's your partner at home, whether it's the person you're working alongside. Be clear about those agreements. Be very clear. Make sure you understand them first, and then make sure others understand them for you. Address boundary issues with the person as soon as they appear. Don't let them hold on to them and build up and be compacted. You want to address them at the moment. Again, with kindness, respect, with love, with humor. But address them. Don't let them build up. Don't let them become something bigger than they are. Be aware of how others interpret your words and actions. Again, that's that self-reflection, understanding yourself, understanding what you say, how you come across. I'm very aware in my work and with my team that I can sometimes come across a certain way. Giles shakes his head. But it's very true. And I am very aware of that. And I need to be aware of that in order to make sure that I am clear with my boundaries and what my struggles may be or aren't, right? And be sure to discuss any issues with your supervisor when necessary, any issues with outside of your supervisor, with the people you trust, the people you love, the people who care for you, the people who are willing to hear you and challenge you. That's an important thing. You need people in your life who are going to question whether or not you're thinking about it right or wrong. and ask you those critical questions. Those again go back to building that healthy boundary with yourself and understanding yourself. We go back to the original quote, the idea of boundaries are things that show us love. That's important. It's an important thing that we show ourselves love and care for ourselves. Results of healthy boundaries: improve self-confidence, improve self-concept, connected with reality. We're able to communicate respectfully with others, improve fulfilling relationships, increase stability and control over our lives, and model healthy boundaries so others can see and learn from them. If that's really important. The very last piece is the most important piece. We can model healthy boundaries so others can learn from them and see them. We then get to see them in others as well.
I wonder if anybody has ever heard the expression that you learn best by teaching. And I think that's what modeling healthy boundaries is. It's about you are teaching other people the way to do things, and because you're doing them yourself. So it just solidifies your own boundaries and helps others identify that, oh yeah, this person that I care about who is important to me. I look at Toby, I go, holy smokes, right? We're pretty much like we're almost the same age. And so when I see him put up his boundaries, I'm able to go, how do those boundaries fit with my self perspective, my own idea of who I am and who I want to be, and that's great. Now I know that people are respecting those boundaries. Now maybe I feel that I can also follow his suit in looking at what my boundaries are most important.
Well said. So talk to your supervisor or colleague. Talk to the people you trust. This is how we help to maintain and upkeep those boundaries. Examine your motivations. What is the intention of the work? Is your intention the same as your impact? Be aware of those things. Acknowledge the agency's policies. This is important because if you can't understand them, you don't understand them, then you can cross those policies often, and then you cross boundaries, and boundaries cross for you, and that's a tricky place to be. If an individual's needs are consistently not being met, discuss with a supervisor or a colleague instead of trying to fill the gaps yourself. So we're all guilty of this. We're all guilty of, we're going to get an A in a group project even if nobody else is going to participate, because that's just who we are. It's important that we recognize them, we acknowledge them, we talk to people about them. We don't just try to fill in. This is where we get into that trouble of we're the only people who can help. In doing this, we lose sight of ourselves. We lose sight of our responsibility to our family and to ourselves and to the people we work alongside, and we get into a lot of trouble. So again, that doesn't have to be your supervisor or your colleague. It can be anybody who you trust, who you feel can help you see the forest for the trees, to use that metaphor. Explain boundaries and their importance to others. Explain those boundaries to yourself before you can explain them to others. Understand them, know what they mean, know where they exist and how they show up for you. And find ways to nurture yourself. That's really important. We talk about self-care all the time at MRT, don't we, Giles? And the important piece about self-care is that doesn't mean that you are going to yoga class every other day, or that you're riding your bike twice a week, for 5 kilometers. Sorry?
Or a bubble bath.
Or a bubble bath. It means whatever makes you feel good inside so that you get to carry on and be present with all of yourself and everyone else in your life. But first, it starts with you. And so if that means that sitting on the couch and eating a tub of ice cream and watching Netflix is your self-care and allows for you to be with yourself and be present with yourself, then that's what that means, right? What we want to be aware of is how much substance do we ingest and not ingest when we talk about some self-care. We want to be aware of whether that self-care is actually doing what it's intended to do, which is to bring us back to being present with ourselves, knowing what our boundaries are, and caring and loving ourselves in a respectful way. Anything about self-care you want to add, Giles?
No, I think you nailed it. I want to be mindful of the time as it's 12.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So use time off from your position to rejuvenate and refuel. Sick days are welcome. Okay. These are just some ideas around boundaries assessments, right? I don't need to go over them. You can see them all. Know yourself. We talked about this. Prioritize what's important to you the most. This is supposed to be. Those were supposed to be hidden slides. Okay. When you recover and discover something that nourishes your soul and brings you joy, care enough about yourself to make room for it in your life. That is the end of our session. I guess we're going to open up to questions. This is the mobile response team. Please take this number down and email. Please reach out to us if you need anything. There is not a silly question or a weird request that we're not going to try and solve for you on some level. We're happy to chat. Remember, we are free and confidential. And thank you again for having us.
And I'd like to say, when I spoke about the crisis lines, this is exactly it. You're able to reach out to those phone number, that 1-800 number, that toll-free number, sorry. And you can reach out directly to us for private, confidential, and free psychosocial support. And so please don't hesitate to reach out, because we're here to listen, and we are so abundantly appreciative of all the work that all of you are doing in the entire province, keeping the healthcare up and running. So thank you so much for everything.
Thank you so much. Oh, there's just a question that popped up. Must you work for one of the health authorities to access this?
You do not. So there was a first question that I'm going to quickly answer or mention too. You can visit Care for Caregivers to sign in. There is also a leadership roundtable that takes place the first Wednesday of each month that myself and a colleague host. And we hold the space for individuals to come and share experiences, the hard times, the good times, and figure out how to work better. So you can get that through Care for Caregivers, and it takes place the first Wednesday of each month at 1 o'clock. You do not need to be a part of one of the health authorities. We provide supports to frontline workers, first responders, and people with lived and living experience impacted by the dual public health emergencies. So my understanding within BC is that everybody's impacted by the overdose crisis and by COVID. So you're all in. There you go. It came to us via Work BC, and I'm not a mental health worker. Can I access? Please. Charmaine, you can please access us. So I always say this as an MRT member. I've moved off of working on the front line because I've done my 20 years of that, and now because of my age, my stage, and my physical abilities, now I provide, and MRT provides resources and supports to people who are working on the front lines, like yourselves, nurses and doctors and healthcare, everybody working who is impacted by this. So please, it's always better to just reach out and ask, because as I said before in the crisis lines, nobody's going to say, no, sorry, we don't want to help you. That's not an issue we can help you with.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you, Claudia. Thank you.
If there's any other questions that you feel comfortable sending afterwards, or just want to share privately, you're also welcome to do that. We still have a few more minutes. If there's any questions, comments, anything that they would like to share, please go ahead. I also just posted in the chat the registration for our next webinar, which will be taking place on March 14th. So if you're interested, please, there's still some room available, and the topic is understanding stress injury and enhancing resiliency. So please feel free to sign up for that. Excuse me. There's, I think, another question.
Definitely. Be something to get in touch with you about presenting to us I think it's definitely important to reach out and ask that question. That's from Alice with the credit union. You're right. I think it's abundantly beneficial for everybody to have understanding of boundaries. So I would suggest reach out to the MRT at phsa.ca to ask that question directly to our upper staff to try and expand our mandate to make sure everybody's getting what they need. Charmaine, I'm curious if there are any resources for communication that allows us to set and maintain workplace boundaries. That's a good question. Toby, do you have any words for that?
Yeah, I don't have any resources right now that I can say off resources, but I think one of the things that's important about communication is to remember that we assume that it's being understood. And so asking that clarity again to be sure that people have understood what you said or what you're requesting. And sometimes that's hard. Limiting your email questions in an email to one question per email can be a lot easier. And then people tend to respond to that one question. You ask multiple questions, they tend to respond to the last question. So, but I think that we could definitely find some resources. That'd be a good question for our resource girl and see what she has to say. But yeah, Charmaine, I think that's the question. That's the answer that I would give you.
So Toby, are you saying that currently you don't have any answers, but we can ask somebody else about it? And if you're sending emails, maybe just send one question at a time. Is that just so I understand? I don't want to make assumptions.
That's correct. That's what I said. Well, way to clarify and role model that communication clarification, Giles. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much to our facilitators, Toby and Giles. The recording, the resources talked about in the webinar today, as well as the slides, will be mailed out to everybody post-webinar. I'll be sending that out tomorrow. And if you have any questions in the interim or after you receive the information, please feel free to reach out. I will be sharing the contact information listed here as well as a brief survey. I just wanted to share the Care for Caregivers page that was talked about. Please do feel free to access those resources. They're for frontline workers and to support mental health. We have the Care to Speak program, which is a phone-based or text or web-based that you could reach out to for support as well. And we are also working on our podcast series. So if there's any topics or speakers that you would be interested in having or seeing on there, please let us know about those as well. And being mindful of your time, I just want to say thank you to everyone once again. It was so great for me, especially to reaffirm understanding boundaries, personal, professional, and knowing that it's loving myself and not limiting myself. It's a great reminder. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We very much appreciate it and looking forward to our next webinar. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you.